"You're too old for 5 bedrooms," my son said. My next move left him absolutely speechless. My son stood in my kitchen, the kitchen I paid off with my own 2 hands, and told me I was too old to live in my own house. He said it like he was doing me a favor. He said it like he'd already made the decision. What he didn't know was that I had made a decision 2-3 years earlier, sitting in a lawyer's office he never even knew existed. And by the time he finished his little speech about what's best for me, it was already far, far too late for him to do anything about it. My name is Jessica. I'm 74 years old. And this is the story of how my own son tried to take my home out from under me, and how I made sure he'd remember exactly who he was dealing with. Before I get into it, if you're the kind of person who believes elders deserve respect, not eviction notices dressed up as concern, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like mine. And subscribe if you haven't already, because I've got more of these, and trust me, they only get better. Now drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Alright, let's get into it. I need you to understand something about this house before I tell you what my son tried to do to me in it. My husband, Walter, and I bought this 5-bedroom colonial in 1979. We were young, broke, and stupidly optimistic. The house was a wreck back then. The roof leaked, the wiring was from another century, and the backyard was more weeds than grass. But it had good bones, Walter used to say. He was a contractor by trade, and he saw what that house could become long before I did. For the next 15 years we poured everything we had into it. Walter rewired the whole place himself on weekends. I stripped wallpaper in every single room by hand, one strip at a time, usually with a baby on my hip. We raised 3 children in that house, my son and his 2 younger sisters. We hosted 40 Thanksgivings there. Walter died in that house in our bedroom upstairs 11 years ago, with me holding his hand. That house isn't just square footage to me. It's the only physical place on this earth that still holds my whole life in it. So when my son sat me down 2 years ago and told me the house was too much house for a woman my age, something in me went very quiet and very cold. Let me tell you about my son. I'll call him Bradley, because that's close enough to who he is without giving away every detail of our life. Bradley is 51 years old. He's a regional sales director for a mid-sized logistics company, and he married a woman named Jennifer about 14 years ago. Jennifer is sharp, ambitious, and has never once in 14 years called me anything other than Jessica. Never mom, never anything warm. I used to think that was just her personality. I know better now. Bradley and Jennifer live about 20 minutes from me, in a newer development with a homeowners association, and a monthly fee that always seemed to stress Bradley out whenever it came up in conversation. They have 2 kids, my grandchildren Emma and Tyler, who I adore, and who I used to see almost every weekend back before all of this happened. 4 years, Bradley's visits to my house were warm, genuine even. He'd bring the kids over, we'd sit on the back porch, and he'd talk about how much he loved this house growing up. Best house on the block, Mom, he used to say. Dad built something special here. That all changed about 2 years ago. And it changed fast. It started small. Little comments dropped into conversation like stray pebbles. Mom, this place is a lot of upkeep for one person. You know, Jennifer was saying the other day how a smaller place would really free you up. Have you thought about what happens if you fall on those stairs? Nobody would even know. At first, I brushed it off as concern. He's my son. Sons worry. I told myself that. But the comments kept coming and they kept getting sharper, and eventually they stopped sounding like concern and started sounding like a campaign. Then about 8 months ago, Bradley showed up on a Tuesday evening unannounced with a folder under his arm. Inside that folder were printouts, listings for senior living communities, floor plans for what he called manageable condos, a 1-page document titled, and I remember this exactly, Housing Transition Plan, Mom. He sat across from me at my own kitchen table and slid that folder toward me like he was handing me a business proposal. Mom, he said, you're 74. You're too old for 5 bedrooms. This house needs to be sold. It's the responsible thing to do for you and honestly for all of us. I remember staring at that phrase. For all of us. Not for me. For all of us. I asked him what he meant by that. He said the market was strong right now. He said a house like this fully paid off in this neighborhood could go for close to $900,000. He said it would be smart, his word smart, for me to sell now, move into a 2-bedroom condo he'd already picked out for me, and put the difference toward the family's future. The family's future. Meaning his. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that about me. I am not a woman who falls apart in the moment. I fall apart later in private and then I get to work. I told Bradley I'd think about it. He left that folder on my table like a challenge, kissed me on the cheek, and walked out like he just closed a sale. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I started putting pieces together that I'd been ignoring for months. Jennifer's sister had recently gone through a bitter divorce, and I remembered Jennifer mentioning, almost in passing months back, how devastating it was that her sister hadn't protected herself financially before the marriage fell apart. I remembered Bradley asking me casually at a birthday dinner last year whether Walter and I had ever set up a trust. I remembered a phone call I'd overheard the edges of, where Bradley was talking to someone about when Mom's place finally sells. Finally sells. As if it were already decided. As if it were only a matter of time before my house became a line item in somebody else's spreadsheet. I called my daughter, Emma's aunt, my younger daughter, the following morning. I asked her carefully if Bradley had said anything to her about the house. She went quiet for a second too long, and then she told me everything. Bradley and Jennifer were underwater on some investments. Not catastrophically, but enough that Jennifer had been pushing hard, for over a year, for Bradley to find a way to access what she called the equity sitting in your mother's house doing nothing. My daughter told me Jennifer had actually said, at a family dinner I wasn't invited to, that it was irresponsible for a woman my age to be sitting on that kind of money while they struggled to refinance their own home. Sitting on my own home. As if living in the house my husband built with his hands was some kind of hoarding. That was the moment something in me shifted from hurt into strategy. Here's something my son didn't know about me, and honestly something most people in my life didn't know about me either. 3 years before any of this started, long before Bradley ever brought that folder to my kitchen table, I had already gone to see an estate attorney. Not because I suspected anything back then. I went because Walter's death had scared me into finally getting my affairs in order, the way responsible adults are supposed to do and so rarely actually do. The attorney's name was Patricia, and she specialized in elder law and estate planning. I sat in her office and told her exactly what I wanted. I wanted to make absolutely certain that no one, not a hospital, not a nursing facility, not even my own children, could ever force a sale of my home while I was alive against my wishes for any reason. Patricia set up something called an irrevocable life estate, combined with a trust structure that put the house itself into a protective trust with very specific, very deliberate terms. In plain language, here's what it meant. I retained full, absolute, legal right to live in that house until the day I died or chose to leave it myself. No one, and I mean no one, could sell it, refinance it, borrow against it, or force any transaction involving that property without my personal signature. Not my children. Not a court. Barring extraordinary circumstances that didn't apply to my situation. Not anyone. And there was one more clause. A clause I'd almost forgotten about myself until that night at my kitchen table. If any beneficiary of my estate attempted to coerce, pressure, or take legal action to force the sale or transfer of the property while I was alive and competent, that beneficiary would be automatically and permanently removed from any inheritance tied to the property, full stop. Patricia had called it at the time an insurance clause for peace of mind. I'd signed it and mostly forgotten about it, filed away like an umbrella you buy and never expect to actually need. I needed it now. I called Patricia the next morning. I told her everything, the folder, the comments about my age, the conversation my daughter had overheard about Jennifer wanting access to the equity. Patricia listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do. And then she said something I'll never forget. Jessica, you already built the wall. You just have to decide whether you want to let him find out he's standing outside it, or whether you want to be the one who tells him. I chose to tell him. On my terms, in my house, at my table. I invited Bradley over for what he thought was going to be a conversation about seriously considering the condo. I made a pot of coffee. I set out the good cups, the ones Walter and I got as a wedding gift, the ones I only bring out for important occasions. And I invited Patricia to join us, sitting quietly at the far end of the table with a folder of her own. Bradley walked in that Sunday afternoon looking pleased with himself. He sat down, glanced at Patricia with mild confusion and said, "Mom, who's this?" I said, "This is Patricia. She's my attorney. I asked her to come today because I have some things to tell you, and I wanted a professional here to make sure everything I say is completely accurate." I watched his expression shift from confused to cautious. I told him calmly that I knew about Jennifer's financial situation. I told him I knew about the conversation at the family dinner I wasn't invited to. I told him I understood fully that this housing transition plan had very little to do with my safety and almost everything to do with the equity sitting in a house I'd spent 45 years turning into a home. Bradley started to protest. He said I was misunderstanding, that it was about my well-being, that Jennifer had nothing to do with any of it. That's when Patricia opened her folder. Patricia laid out, in plain, unhurried language, the terms of the trust I'd established 3 years earlier. She explained the life estate. She explained that I had full and irrevocable right to remain in that house for the rest of my life, and that no sale, no refinance, no transaction of any kind could occur without my direct, voluntary signature. And then she got to the clause. She explained that, as of that folder Bradley had brought to my kitchen table 8 months ago, the printed listings, the housing transition plan document with his own name on it, combined with the conversations my daughter had witnessed regarding pressuring me to sell, this activity met the threshold that had been defined in writing 3 years prior as an attempt to coerce a sale of the protected property, which meant, under the terms I had signed, witnessed, and notarized long before any of this began, Bradley had just permanently and irrevocably forfeited his portion of inheritance tied to that house. The house itself, upon my death, would now pass entirely and exclusively to my 2 daughters, split evenly between them, with Bradley's name removed from that specific portion of my estate, permanently, with no path to reverse it, because that was the entire point of the clause. It wasn't a punishment I handed down in anger. It was a mechanism I had built years earlier, quietly, specifically to protect myself from exactly this moment, without knowing exactly who might someday cause it. I watched my son's face while Patricia spoke. I watched the color leave it in stages. I watched him open his mouth twice to argue, and close it both times, because there was genuinely nothing to argue with. It wasn't an opinion. It was a legally binding document he'd never known existed, triggered by his own actions, executed by his own hand when he brought that folder into my house. He didn't say a word for almost a full minute. My son, who has never once in his adult life been at a loss for words in a negotiation, sat completely silent at my kitchen table. Finally, he asked quietly, "You had this the whole time?" I told him yes. I told him I'd had it for 3 years, long before I had any reason to suspect I'd need it, because that's what protecting yourself actually looks like. You do it before the danger arrives, not after. I won't pretend the months since then have been easy. Bradley didn't storm out that day. He sat there, quiet and pale, for a long while, and then he left without finishing his coffee. We didn't speak for almost 6 weeks after that. Jennifer, understandably, has not called me since, not once. My daughters, on the other hand, showed up the very next weekend with groceries and a bottle of wine, and we sat on the same back porch Walter and I built with our own hands, and we talked for 4 hours straight. Bradley did eventually call me about 2 months later. It wasn't an apology, not really, more of an attempt to understand how I could have done that to him. I told him gently but honestly that I didn't do anything to him. I protected something my husband and I built, using a plan I'd made years before he ever tried to take it from me. He was the one who triggered a clause he didn't know existed by trying to pressure his 74-year-old mother out of her own home for financial gain. I simply let the consequences he set in motion play out exactly as they were always designed to. We're speaking again now, slowly, carefully. He sees Emma and Tyler at my house most weekends still, which I'm grateful for, because none of this was ever about punishing my grandchildren for their parents' choices. But something fundamental shifted that day at my kitchen table, and I don't think it will ever fully shift back. I think Bradley finally understands that I am not a line item. I am not equity sitting idle. I am a woman who built a life inside those walls, and who was fully prepared years in advance to defend it. People love to assume that once you cross a certain age you become soft, foggy, easy to move around like furniture. They start talking about you instead of to you. They start making plans for your life in rooms you're not invited into. What my son learned sitting at that kitchen table with his coffee going cold is that some of us spend our 70s exactly the way we spent our 30s and 40s, thinking 3 steps ahead, protecting what matters, and quietly building walls long before anyone ever tries to test them. I still live in that 5-bedroom house. I still climb those stairs every single night. And I sleep just fine. If this story meant something to you, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe for more. It makes a genuine difference for this channel. And I'd love to know one more time where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of what's yours.